Coming into this guest house here, it has a distinct dorm room feel to it in terms of shared lifestyle, in terms of shared space. And it's interesting because, I've been studying cycles and, cyclical motions and repeating patterns and spirals, right? Like for many years, and it's really, the more I live and sort of grow, the more I see that I loop back in many different ways to very similar anchor points at the very beginning, but with a sort of like spin to the return of the feedback cycle, before I take off again. And pretty much like it's kind of cool because I'm like when I was a freshman, I stayed in the dorms, right? And that was like my first taste of freedom outside the household, like, and it was like an hour away from the nest, in other words. And that was my first taste of freedom, but it was like the cheap housing, and it was very tightly packed. We were like sardines, and we shared bathrooms, and there was a lot of shared, just ness to the atmosphere. And then going from there, and now I'm sort of like a freshman on the world stage, and I'm starting over again, but on a greater scale, on a planetary scale, and but very similar hospitality, like, nuances show up again, like in terms of shared housing and stuff like that, and in terms of like uh, just like it's just so interesting to see the cycles repeat on that level. And when I was down on the Big Island studying permaculture and doing my, like, basically, like, I was in an environment where I felt comfortable and in fact highly encouraged to step deep into like my center point, to grow, to root down. And so, like, I started practicing every day. Like, at first it was like stretching. Like, I was started with Jenna's yoga class, and that basically kicked my ass. I mean, like, even though I was like light stretching, just the flow of movements, I would wake up and I'd just be sore. I'd be like, oh man, where did that come from? Like, as I was moving into my body, just kind of like, whoa, like, huh, interesting. Like, the more I would move into my body, like, I'd feel soreness, as I would come to feel myself in my physical form. And then from there, I sort of like started rolling around in the grass and started like doing gymnastics moves, now that I sort of like got stretched out a little bit. And, like, and one of my goals was to get more like masculine and strong, like more creative, more rather than receptive, more forward moving rather than soft, like. And so like I went from gymnastics, which was in like high school, so I'm starting to like loop back through, and I went past that down into back when I was like a youth, like when I was a kid, like all the way back to when I was 5 years old, and I started karate, and martial arts. I went from like, spatial awareness and movement down into like martial arts again. And so like to see that loop back, is just so interesting, and to like step back into it and remember the different movements that I went through now with like a greater understanding of like internal style and a stillness there, and actually remembering on a body level the different movements, and the reasons to do different things, and with a more subtler awareness of like things like energy movement, and how to build it and how to hold it and how to like flux it and push it and pull it, like, that was cool to really like, in terms of like, that took me all the way back to when I was a child, and that was super interesting. And then to go even further than that, there's been a couple times where I've sat in ceremony and actually drank medicine, Amazonian medicine, where I actually went all the way back and through the birth process, you know, like I went back to that birth point and boom, did it again, you know what I mean? Like, it was like, that's like the long cycle, the major cycle, the ultimate cycle, you know, like to do that is like complete medicine, you know, to go through that process. And like, so these like loops, you know, like, and even in the medicine ceremonies, you know, like the return to source cycle, you know, like going through that, like, you know, like that's like such a healing place, like in terms of confrontation, you know, to like step into that void and like completely surrender and just like embrace whatever's about to happen, you know, like that surrender, that letting go, boom, you know, like everything, personality, ego, identity, whew, just let it go and just like fall into the void, you know, to sort of like twist inside out, you know, and to sort of like float through this like unexplainable nothingness to like a sense of like hatching again, you know, like there's like a blank period there, but there's an awareness, but it's blank, right? Like that's the paradox, you know, to like all of a sudden being able to associate memories, boom, right at that birth point, you know, like, oh yeah, this is what it feels like again, you know, like to go through that cycle, you know, like it's just so amazing, like, and then actually to go through, you know, like the like the infancy phase and to come back, you know, like, and so it's just speaking to these various cycles, you know, the birth, death, the return to various like streams of art form, you know, that I've sort of swam through, and then even more recently, just like cycles of freedom and sort of like culture and living space, you know, like, and just to see them repeat, and what it's like to be a student, you know, and then to come back to being a student in various ways, and then feeling what it's like to be a master and playing that role, you know, and then coming back to being a student, you know, like, it's just, it's so cool, and I just love it, I just love it.